The day had arrived, and the tension in the air was almost suffocating. The normally routine proceedings of a congressional hearing in Washington, D.C. had taken on a much deeper significance. The fluorescent camera lights flickered as microphones hummed softly in the background, amplifying the quiet whispers that filled the room. It was supposed to be an ordinary discussion on government funding, dry and technical. But today, something felt different. There was an undeniable tension, an electricity that hung over the room, signaling that what was about to unfold would be anything but ordinary. The people in the hearing room could feel it before they saw it. There was a sense that something was coming, a moment, a turning point, that would affect everyone present, and those watching from the outside. The camera lenses zoomed in on the figures sitting at the table, capturing every shift in body language, every slight movement, as if trying to predict what would happen next. This was no longer just a political hearing. It was personal. On one side of the room sat Linda McMahon, a figure whose reputation loomed large. As a former WWE executive and a seasoned political player, Linda had earned her place in the halls of power. She had navigated the brutal world of professional wrestling and political backrooms with equal skill. Her poise, her confidence, her ability to manipulate situations, everything about her screamed authority. McMahon was used to being in control. She was accustomed to facing off against men who underestimated her and knew how to use her sharp tongue and polished public persona to get what she wanted. But across the table, the rising star of Congress, Jasmine Crockett, was a force to be reckoned with. A freshman congresswoman from Texas, Crockett was young, fierce, and unapologetically herself. She had quickly gained national attention for her bold stances on social justice and racial equality. But those same qualities had made her a target for the political establishment. Her unapologetic nature and her refusal to be silenced had earned her both admiration and scorn. While she might have been new to the political scene, Crockett had already shown that she wasn't afraid to stand up for what she believed in, no matter who it upset. Today, however, the spotlight was on her in a way that she had never experienced before. As she entered the hearing room, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, some with skepticism, others with curiosity. Everyone knew that this hearing was meant to be a simple discussion about government funding. But everyone also knew it was quickly going to turn into something much bigger. The whispers in the room grew louder as Crockett took her seat, her gaze focused and unwavering. She wasn't going to back down from what was coming. But she had no idea just how deep this battle would go. Linda McMahon wasted no time. She had been preparing for this moment, and she knew exactly how to play her cards. With a smile that seemed almost too rehearsed, she leaned forward and addressed Crockett, her voice dripping with condescension. She spoke as though trying to guide the young congresswoman, as though she was doing her a favor. "Congresswoman Crockett," Linda began, "while I appreciate your enthusiasm, perhaps it would serve you better to speak with a little more composure. This isn't a pep rally." The words hung in the air like a slap, and the room instantly fell into an uncomfortable silence. There was no mistaking the intent behind Linda's words. This wasn't about the policies being discussed. Wasn't about the government funding. This was personal. Linda wasn't just questioning Crockett's stance on the issues. She was trying to diminish her, to reduce her to a mere spectacle in a world where power was still largely dominated by men. As the camera panned across the faces in the room, it became clear that this moment was a pivotal one. Politicians and reporters alike exchanged nervous glances. They knew that this exchange was far more than just a battle of words. It was the beginning of a confrontation that would not just shake up the hearing but could change the political landscape itself. Jasmine Crockett's reaction was immediate. She leaned forward in her chair, unshaken by the attack. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no sign of fear. She had faced worse before. She had been underestimated her entire life, And now, standing before one of the most powerful women in American politics, she wasn't about to let anyone silence her. "I've been called loud before," Crockett's voice rang out, calm and steady, but laced with an undeniable force. Her words were sharp, cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. "I've been told to calm down, to sit back, to wait my turn. But what you call enthusiasm, ma'am, I call passion. What you call loud, I call not being afraid anymore. And what you tried to do just now, that wasn't about me being out of line. That was about you feeling uncomfortable with a woman who isn't afraid to take up space." A hush fell over the room. The force of her words struck like thunder, reverberating through the walls. The other politicians sat frozen, unsure of how to react. Linda McMahon's face remained fixed in that same smile, but her eyes, for the briefest of moments, betrayed her. The cameras zoomed in, catching a flicker of doubt in her expression, a crack in the armor she had so carefully built. It was clear that Crockett's words had landed hard. There was a shift in the energy of the room. Linda McMahon, for all her experience and power, was no longer the dominant force. In that moment, she was the one being exposed. Not as the powerful woman she liked to portray, but as someone who had been outmaneuvered by a younger, sharper mind. The truth was out there. Linda was no longer the underdog fighting for a seat at the table. Now, she was the gatekeeper, the establishment that Jasmine Crockett was fighting to break. The cameras captured this tension, this shift. Linda's carefully curated image as an untouchable political figure began to crack. The smile remained, but her eyes grew wet with a vulnerability she had long since buried. The tears that filled her eyes weren't of anger or guilt, but of recognition. It was a reminder of the woman she used to be, the one who had been told to sit down and shut up, the one who had to fight for every inch of space. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, until Crockett's voice broke through again. She wasn't finished. "I didn't get here because I waited for permission," she said, each word steady, deliberate. "I got here because I refuse to be overlooked, okay? And I won't let you or anyone frame my strength as a weakness." The room was still. No one spoke. The world outside was watching. And in that moment, the fate of these two women and their futures in the halls of power was sealed. The room remained eerily silent after Jasmine Crockett's powerful words. It was as though time itself had stopped, leaving only the sound of the soft hum of microphones filling the air. Linda McMahon, for the first time, seemed unsure of how to respond. Her poised smile, the one that had served her so well in her years of climbing to the top of both WWE and political circles, faltered. Her eyes flickered with a brief flash of vulnerability, quickly masked by a quick blink. The audience could see it, a momentary crack in the facade of a woman who had spent decades carefully constructing her image. Jasmine, however, stood firm. Her posture was one of quiet strength as her gaze remained locked on McMahon. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let the woman across from her or anyone else tell her how to behave or who to be. The undercurrent of everything McMahon had said in the last few minutes about composure, about tone, about being too loud was clear. It was an attempt to erase the very things that made Jasmine Crockett who she was. It was an attempt to silence her. But Crockett wouldn't be silenced. In that moment, her defiance was not just personal. It was symbolic of everything she had fought for and everything she stood against. This was not just a confrontation in a hearing room. It was a battle of ideologies. It was the old guard of power, represented by McMahon, against the new wave of politicians, represented by Crockett. One woman, an established figure who had spent years clawing her way to the top, trying to keep her place. The other, a newcomer, who had broken through barriers with nothing but her voice and her determination. The camera lenses focused on Linda McMahon, capturing the tightness in her jaw, the slight tremor of her hands as she adjusted her notes. The woman who had once controlled the narrative in the WWE, who had helped shape the world of televised drama and political theater, now seemed out of her depth. This person who had once commanded the stage now looked like she might crumble under the weight of Crockett's words. The shift in the room wasn't just about power, it was about control. Linda had always been in control, and now that control was slipping away from her. Mick Mahone, however, was no stranger to conflict. She had survived in a world where every word and every move had consequences. She had learned how to turn the tables, how to regain control when she was backed into a corner. And, despite the vulnerability showing in her eyes, Linda was not going to let this opportunity to assert her dominance slip away. The media was watching. Her political career, her reputation, everything she had worked for was on the line. She could not afford to lose this moment. Clearing her throat, she tried to reclaim her composure. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her voice steady but cold, "while your words are certainly impassioned, they miss the mark. What we are discussing here is not about loud voices or who is more determined. It's about solutions. It's about leadership. And sometimes leadership requires the strength to remain composed, to put aside personal grievances and to work for the greater good." But Crockett wasn't buying it. She had seen this type of tactic before, the way powerful figures use their calm demeanor to make others feel small. She had been told to be quieter, to be more composed, to fit into a mold that others had created for her. She wasn't going to let Linda McMahon or anyone else define what kind of leader she could be. "Don't try to lecture me on leadership," Linda Crockett shot back, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Leadership isn't about pretending to be something you're not. It's about facing the truth even when it's uncomfortable. And what's uncomfortable here is that you don't like the way I speak, the way I carry myself, because I'm not afraid to be real. I'm not afraid to stand up and say what others are too scared to say. So don't tell me about leadership unless you've been in the trenches where I've been." Her words were met with an uneasy murmur from the room. The politicians sitting at the table exchanged looks, some clearly uncomfortable, others nodding in quiet agreement. This wasn't just an exchange of political points anymore. It was a battle for legitimacy, for power, and for who had the right to define the conversation. Linda McMahon, who had once been revered for her ability to manipulate the public narrative, suddenly found herself on the defensive. The carefully curated image she had built over decades was under threat. The calm, collected figure that people saw on television was now a woman grappling with a young, unapologetic congresswoman who refused to back down. The reality of the situation hit her hard. This wasn't just a hearing about funding or policy. This was about something deeper, control for the first time. Linda McMahon's carefully constructed armor seemed to buckle under the pressure of Jasmine Crockett's raw truth. But Linda had fought too hard for too long to give up now. She wasn't going to let a moment of weakness define her. Instead, she chose to play a different card. "Do you think you've faced the worst, Jasmine? Let me tell you something," McMahon said, her voice low but seething with an undercurrent of fury. "There are people in this room who have been fighting this battle much longer than you've been alive. You think your words are going to change anything? You think your passion is going to shift the system? You have no idea what it takes to survive in this game." The words were biting, meant to provoke, to test Jasmine's resolve. But instead of retreating, Crockett leaned in, her eyes narrowing with determination. "You think I don't know the cost of this fight?" she asked, her voice dripping with defiance. "You don't get to tell me what I've earned, what I've fought for. I didn't get here because I played it safe. I got here because I took risks, because I stayed true to myself, even when people like you told me it wasn't enough." The room held its breath. The world was watching. And in that moment, it was clear that the stakes had escalated. This wasn't just a political battle. It was a battle for identity, for voice, for power. Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a congresswoman in a hearing room. She was a symbol of the changing tides in American politics. And Linda McMahon, for all her experience, was finding herself outmatched in ways she never expected. The battle in the congressional hearing room was far from over. The tension had only just begun to simmer. and what seemed like a political showdown between Linda McMahon and Jasmine Crockett had quickly turned into something much deeper. As the cameras flashed and the media buzzed, it became clear that this was no ordinary hearing. The words exchanged weren't just about policy, they were about power, legacy, and the very fabric of American politics. Outside the hearing room, the media machine kicked into high gear. Headlines flooded the screens. Linda McMahon's confrontation with Congresswoman Crockett sparks national debate. Jasmine Crockett breaks silence in epic showdown with political giant. The nation was captivated by the fiery exchange between the seasoned political figure and the up-and-coming Congresswoman. But what many didn't know was that the real drama had only just begun. The truth was that Linda McMahon, the once untouchable powerhouse, had built her empire on secrets that, if revealed, could bring it all crashing down. There was a story beneath the surface, a past that she had buried deep within the dark corners of her rise to power. Linda had clawed her way to the top, not just through political maneuvering, but through calculated control of her public image. She had mastered the art of appearing flawless, invincible, a woman who could not be shaken. But Jasmine's words had exposed a vulnerability in her that she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the confrontation at the hearing anymore. This was about Linda McMahon's own demons catching up with her. The world had never known the full extent of her early struggles. Before she was the political juggernaut that commanded the spotlight, she was just a woman in a man's world, fighting to be taken seriously, fighting to be heard. Linda had once been dismissed, belittled, laughed at. She had fought tooth and nail for a seat at the table, but in doing so, she had forgotten the very lessons that had gotten her there. In her pursuit of power, she had become the gatekeeper, the very figure she had once despised. Jasmine Crockett had touched a nerve, whether she realized it or not. Her refusal to back down, her defiance in the face of Linda's calculated attacks, had made Linda confront the person she had become. She wasn't just the figurehead of a multi-million-dollar empire or a seasoned political operator anymore. For a fleeting moment, she was that young woman again, overlooked, underestimated, struggling to prove herself in a room full of men who thought she didn't belong. But the woman who had once been vulnerable was now no longer afraid of confronting. The past Linda's response to Jasmine had been calculated, but it wasn't just a strategic move. It was her way of telling herself that she was still in control, that she still had the power. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. As Linda tried to regain her composure, the media swirled around her, framing the moment as a defeat for the political elite. Her camp worked overtime to control the narrative, launching a smear campaign against Crockett, attempting to paint her as an inexperienced firebrand, a loose cannon. But the media wasn't buying it. The public had seen something else, something more real. The press latched onto Crockett's words, the rawness of her passion, her refusal to be silenced by an established system that had long favored power over truth. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett had become a symbol of hope for many. Her courage to speak out against the political establishment had struck a chord with young people, marginalized communities, and those who felt their voices had long been ignored. She was quickly becoming a political force, not just in Washington, but across the country. Her rise wasn't just a personal victory, it was a movement. One that represented a shift in how people viewed power and politics. But despite her newfound fame, Crockett knew she was far from invincible. The pressure was mounting on all sides. The media, while supportive of her in the moment, was starting to dig into her past, trying to find any weakness to exploit. As her visibility increased, so did the number of enemies she had made. Political elites, threatened by her presence, began to plot their next moves. Linda McMahon was just the beginning. Jasmine's personal history was filled with its own struggles. She had grown up in a world where the odds were stacked against her. Her rise wasn't simply the result of her intelligence or passion. It was the culmination of years of fighting against a system that tried to keep her down. She understood what it was like to be underestimated, to be told that she didn't belong. The difference between her and Linda was that Jasmine had never let anyone silence her. Every obstacle had only made her stronger. As the hearing continued, the political tension between Linda and Jasmine reached a boiling point. What had begun as a debate about policy was now a battle for control of the narrative. Both women understood that the stakes were higher than ever. The fate of their political careers and the direction of the country were intertwined in the outcome of this fight. Behind the scenes, things were even more complicated. While the public watched this clash between two women with very different paths to power, there were forces at play that the audience couldn't see. Lobbyists, foreign governments, and powerful interest groups all had a stake in the outcome. What had started as a personal confrontation was now shaping up to be a global affair. The impact of this political showdown would reach far beyond the borders of Washington, D.C. As the days went by, the media frenzy showed no signs of slowing down. Social media was ablaze with commentary, with some praising Crockett's boldness and others defending McMahon's experience. But the real power of this moment lay not in the media circus or the political games. It was in the hearts and minds of the people. For them, this confrontation represented something much bigger. It was a reflection of the changing dynamics of American politics, where the old guard was beginning to lose its grip on power, and a new generation of leaders was fighting to reshape the system. The stage was set for the next act in this political thriller. Linda McMahon, once untouchable, now had to reckon with the forces that were slowly slipping from her grasp. Jasmine Crockett, still finding her footing, was becoming a symbol of the shift in power that was already underway. And the world was watching. What happened next would shape the future of American politics in ways no one could yet predict. Ask ChatGPT*. As the weeks following the heated congressional hearing passed, the political atmosphere in Washington, D.C. continued to evolve rapidly. Linda McMahon, once a seemingly invincible force in politics, found herself in a precarious position. The media was relentless. Every word she spoke, every move she made, was scrutinized, analyzed, and often criticized. Despite her efforts to control the narrative, her past began to surface in ways that she could no longer control. What she had worked so hard to bury was now being exposed, piece by piece, in public. Investigative journalists, hungry for a story, dug into McMahon's history. They unearthed old interviews, corporate records, and testimonies from people she had once worked with. They painted a picture of a woman who, in her rise to power, had bent the rules and sometimes crossed ethical lines. There were whispers about her involvement in shady deals during her WWE tenure, and the more she tried to distance herself from it, the more the public became convinced that there was something deeper at play. Linda's carefully crafted image of being a political powerhouse and a champion of American values was cracking, and there was no way to stop it. The media storm reached new heights when an anonymous source revealed a series of emails between McMahon and top political figures. Emails that suggested she had been using her influence to manipulate government decisions for her personal and financial gain. These revelations threatened to unravel everything she had worked for. Public opinion shifted, and the narrative that had once painted Linda McMahon as a political mastermind was now seeing her as a symbol of corruption, a woman who would stop at nothing to maintain her grip on power. On the other hand, Jasmine Crockett was riding a wave of support. Her confrontation with McMahon had catapulted her into the national spotlight. People saw her as a voice for change, someone who was not afraid to challenge the status quo and hold powerful figures accountable. She was invited to talk shows, given interviews, and her social media presence exploded. As the press turned its focus to McMahon scandals, they also turned to Crockett as a breath of fresh air in a system that had long been dominated by the same old faces. She was becoming more than just a congresswoman. She was becoming the face of a new generation of leadership. But with this newfound fame came its own set of challenges. The pressure was mounting. Jasmine had to constantly balance her advocacy for the people with the harsh realities of political life. Her once clear moral compass was now being tested, as her every word and action was dissected. She began receiving threats from powerful political figures and interest groups that felt threatened by her rapid rise. The more her influence grew, the more she realized just how difficult it would be to remain true to her principles in a world where power was everything. Behind the scenes, powerful political players from both parties were working to undermine Crockett's credibility. They attacked her for her inexperience, for her radical ideas, and for what they viewed as her disrespect for the system that had kept Washington functioning for so long. While many admired her courage, others saw her as a disruptor, a threat to their established way of doing business. The old guard, which had once been complacent and comfortable, was now on the defensive, doing everything in their power to discredit her and maintain control. Meanwhile, the international community began to take notice. As the media focused more on the unfolding drama between McMahon and Crockett, global leaders saw it as a reflection of the shifting dynamics in American politics. Foreign governments that once relied on McMahon's influence in Washington now found themselves questioning her ability to lead. The political instability in the U.S. created a ripple effect throughout international relations. Nations that had worked closely with McMahon's political camp started pulling back, wary of aligning with a leader who was now seen as damaged goods. The rise of Jasmine Crockett, however, presented a new opportunity for these nations. Crockett's stance on international relations, which was focused on fairness, transparency, and holding powerful nations accountable, resonated with countries that had long felt marginalized by American policy. There was growing speculation about whether Crockett could lead the U.S. into a new era of global diplomacy, one where human rights and equity were prioritized over traditional power dynamics. But with this global attention also came heightened risks. The pressure to perform to meet the expectations of both the American public and the international community was immense. Jasmine Crockett was now at the center of a political storm, with her every decision watched closely by those who hoped she would bring change, and by those who were desperate for her to fail. As the confrontation between McMahon and Crockett evolved, the real battleground was shifting from the hearing room to the public eye. This wasn't just about two women with differing views on politics. It was about the very future of American governance. The question on everyone's mind was whether the entrenched political elites could hold on to power, or if the country was ready to embrace a new kind of leadership, one that was younger, bolder, and far more unpredictable. Both women were playing a dangerous game. McMahon, ever the strategist, had once thrived in the world of manipulation and control. But now, with her past coming back to haunt her and her political allies starting to distance themselves from her, she was losing her grip. She was still powerful, but her power was slipping through her fingers, and every move she made seemed to alienate her further from the public. Crockett, meanwhile, was gaining traction, but knew that power in Washington came with a price. Every move was being watched, her every decision weighed by critics who wanted her to fail. But she also understood the stakes. This wasn't just about one hearing or one political battle, it was about reshaping the very systems that had been in place for generations. The stage was set for a showdown that would transcend politics, echoing through history. McMahon's legacy, built on years of manipulation and careful positioning, was crumbling. Crockett's rise, though fueled by the people's desire for change, came with the heavy burden of what it meant to truly disrupt a system that had always been designed to protect the powerful. Both women were locked in a high-stakes game, and the world was watching, waiting to see which of them would come out on top. The fallout from the congressional hearing had sent shockwaves through Washington, D.C., and the reverberations were being felt around the world. Linda McMahon, once a towering figure in American politics, was now fighting to maintain any semblance of control over her public image. The revelations of her past dealings, the emails that had come to light, And the growing accusations of corruption were slowly but surely dismantling the empire she had spent decades building. In the span of just a few weeks, the very foundation of her power seemed to be crumbling beneath her feet. Her political allies, once loyal, began to distance themselves. A few whispered behind closed doors that it was time for McMahon to step aside. The media's relentless coverage of her past mistakes, her past decisions, and the personal attacks from her opponents had taken a toll. No longer was she the commanding force she once was. Now, she was a figure trying desperately to hang on to a dwindling grasp of power. Each new revelation seemed to confirm what many had long suspected, that Linda McMahon was a product of a system where manipulation and influence had been the key to success, not necessarily merit or integrity. And yet, McMahon refused to go down without a fight. She had weathered storms before, and she wasn't about to let a few investigative stories undo everything she had worked for. Behind the scenes, her team was working overtime, spinning the narrative, calling in favors, and trying to salvage her reputation. But the public's perception had shifted. Linda had once been admired for her business acumen and political savvy. Now she was being vilified for those very same qualities. What was once seen as her strength, her ability to manipulate and control, was now her downfall. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, had become the face of the new political movement that was sweeping the nation. The media continued to follow her every move, captivated by her fiery speeches, her fearless defiance of the old political guard, and her unapologetic stance on social justice. Crockett's rise was nothing short of meteoric. She had tapped into a deep well of discontent among the American people, a frustration with the system that had long been rigged in favor of the powerful. The public's fascination with her was more than just her political positions, it was her authenticity. She didn't play by the rules. She didn't bend to pressure. She spoke the truth, and people were listening. But the attention came at a cost. The more Crockett's star rose, the more enemies she made. The political establishment, threatened by her increasing popularity, began to push back in ways both subtle and overt. The establishment's usual tactics, disinformation, character assassination, and even legal threats were used against her. Lobbyists who had once been her allies were now advising her to tone down her rhetoric. Corporate interests and foreign powers started putting pressure on her, trying to influence her decisions through backdoor dealings. She wasn't just a rising star. She was now a target. Despite the mounting pressure, Crockett remained unflinching. She wasn't about to back down from the ideals that had gotten her to this point. She knew that her voice, her passion, and her refusal to compromise were the only things standing between her and the establishment's desire to silence her. She understood that she was playing a dangerous game, but she was willing to risk it all for the people who had placed their hope in her. In many ways, she felt that her rise wasn't just about hurt, was about giving voice to those who had been ignored for far too long. As the political battles raged on in Washington, the international community began to take a more active interest in the unfolding drama. The U.S. government, once seen as a stable and predictable power, was now a symbol of political chaos and instability. Linda McMahon's fall from grace had rattled allies who had once relied on her influence to secure deals and maintain relationships. Foreign governments, particularly those who had aligned themselves with McMahon's camp, were beginning to pull back, unsure of where America's future leadership would lie. The U.S. was teetering on the edge of a political shift that could have far-reaching consequences for global diplomacy. Countries that had long been critical of U.S. foreign policy saw an opportunity to push for change. They watched as the narrative around McMahon's corruption unfolded, and they saw Crockett's rise as a sign that the old guard might finally be giving way to something new, something more aligned with their interests. Jasmine Crockett's stance on international relations, one that prioritized human rights, equity, and diplomacy over military might and corporate greed, was a stark contrast to the policies of the past. For some nations, her leadership represented hope for a future where the U.S. could be a global partner. Not just a dominant force, but even as Crockett's influence grew on the world stage, she was still learning the complexities of international diplomacy. While she had the backing of many on the ground in the U.S., the world of global politics was more nuanced and treacherous than she had anticipated. Foreign leaders who initially seemed to support her ideals were now testing her resolve, challenging her with difficult decisions that would shape the future of American foreign policy. Meanwhile, Linda McMahon was fighting for survival, trying to salvage what little power she had left. Her political camp was scrambling to contain the damage, attempting to undermine Crockett's rise by calling her naive, inexperienced, and too idealistic for the realities of international politics. They warned that Crockett's bold stances on diplomacy and human rights would alienate the U.S. from its allies, putting the country at risk. McMahon, though weakened, was still a formidable force, and she wasn't about to let her legacy slip into obscurity without one last fight. The tension between the two women was reaching a boiling point. The media, always hungry for a story, had begun to paint them as polar opposites. McMahon, the seasoned politician with years of experience, and Crockett, the fiery, idealistic young congresswoman who was shaking up the system. Both women were on a collision course, and it was becoming increasingly clear that one of them would have to give. For Crockett, the stakes were higher than ever. The political establishment, both at home and abroad, was determined to see her fail. But for her supporters, her success was seen as a victory for the people, proof that change was possible, even in a system that seemed rigged against them. As the tension between Crockett and McMahon continued to escalate, it became evident that this battle wasn't just about their political futures, it was about the future of American democracy itself. Linda McMahon's legacy was at risk, and Jasmine Crockett's path to power was filled with obstacles. But neither woman was willing to back down. The battle for control of Washington, D.C. was reaching its peak, and the outcome would shape the political landscape for years to come. The world was watching, waiting for the moment when everything would change. As the political tension in Washington, D.C. escalated, a new, unexpected turn of events began to unfold. Both Linda McMahon and Jasmine Crockett found themselves at the center of a global storm, each struggling with forces far beyond their control. The battle between the old political establishment, represented by McMahon, and the fresh, fearless energy of Crockett had transformed into a fight for the future of American democracy itself. But neither woman could have predicted the new challenge that was about to disrupt everything they thought they knew about power, politics, and loyalty. Behind closed doors, whispers about McMahon's past dealings continued to grow louder. Investigative journalists had uncovered even more damaging details about her history. A series of leaked documents revealed that McMahon had been involved in backroom deals with foreign leaders, deals that promised lucrative business contracts in exchange for political influence. These revelations were far more serious than anyone had anticipated. McMahon, who had always been able to control the narrative in Washington, now found herself unable to avoid the growing storm of scandal. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. The once powerful woman who had built her political career on being an indomitable force was now being painted as a corrupt, power-hungry figure who would stop at nothing to maintain her grip on influence. The media storm reached a fever pitch. Social media exploded with hashtags calling for McMahon's resignation, and protests against her continued to grow in intensity. Her supporters were dwindling, as even those who had once admired her began to question her motives. As the scandal deepened, Linda McMahon was left with only one option: to fight back. She knew that if she allowed the public's perception of her to solidify, her career and perhaps even her legacy would be destroyed. So, in a last-ditch attempt to regain control, she turned to her greatest weapon, her experience in media manipulation. McMahon had spent years in the public eye, and she knew how to use the media to her advantage. She began a full-scale counterattack, using every tool at her disposal to fight back against the narrative that had painted her as corrupt. She issued a public statement denying the accusations, calling them a politically motivated smear campaign designed to tear her down. She attacked the press for sensationalizing the truth, accusing them of twisting the facts for the sake of ratings. But despite her efforts, it was clear that the damage had already been done. The public's trust in her had eroded, and no amount of damage control could fix the hole in her reputation. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett was watching the unfolding scandal with a mixture of concern and determination. She knew that her rise to power had made her a target, but she hadn't anticipated the full scale of the media war she was about to enter. As McMahon's battle for her legacy raged on, Crockett found herself thrust into the spotlight even more. The media, now fascinated by the dramatic clash between the two women, turned their attention toward Crockett, analyzing her every move. While McMahon's scandal dominated the news, Crockett's political savvy was also starting to shine. She navigated the media frenzy with grace, staying true to her message of change, transparency, and holding the powerful accountable. Her bold positions on social justice, equality, and reform had earned her the support of millions of Americans. But her rise had not come without consequences. The political establishment, which had once seen her as a nuisance, now viewed her as a genuine threat. Behind the scenes, powerful interest groups began to target her, tempting to discredit her and derail her momentum. But Crockett had something that McMahon, for all her experience, could not replicate: authenticity. As the public watched her stand strong against the establishment, she became the symbol of a new kind of politics, one that didn't bow to the influence of money, power, or corruption. She had come from humble beginnings, and everything she said resonated with people who were tired of being ignored. Unlike McMahon, whose power had always been built on manipulating the system, Crockett's appeal lay in her willingness to tear it down and rebuild it from the ground up. But despite her growing popularity, Crockett knew she was walking a fine line. The political battle was no longer just about her ideals or her passion for change; it was about survival. As McMahon continued to fight back, Crockett found herself facing increasing pressure to conform to the political system she had once sworn to change. The establishment tried to convince her that her radical ideas were unsustainable, that she needed to compromise if she wanted to truly make a difference. But Crockett refused to back down. She knew that the only way to bring real change to Washington was to disrupt the system completely. And just when it seemed like Crockett might emerge victorious in the battle for public opinion, something unexpected happened. A new scandal broke, this time involving a key member of Crockett's inner circle. It was a carefully timed hit. The news was explosive, detailing an alleged financial impropriety that was said to have occurred during Crockett's early days in Congress. The media, eager to fuel the fire of scandal, pounced on the story. The smear campaign against her was in full swing. Crockett, shaken but resolute, knew that this was the moment that would define her future. Would she fall victim to the same political games that had plagued the establishment for so long? Or would she rise above the chaos and prove that a different kind of politics was possible? The pressure on her was immense, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Her every move would be analyzed, scrutinized, and judged by a public that was increasingly cynical about politics. The battle for the soul of American politics had reached its peak. On one side stood Linda McMahon, a woman whose power had been built on a foundation of manipulation and control, desperately trying to salvage her legacy. On the other side stood Jasmine Crockett, a young, idealistic congresswoman who was challenging the very system that had long held power in its grasp. But both women were facing a common enemy: the political system itself, as the scandals surrounding Crockett threatened to derail her career. McMahon's hold on power continued to slip. The once unassailable leader was now fighting for her place in history, while Crockett fought for a future in which politics could be more than just a game of manipulation and control. In the end, the outcome of this battle would depend not on who was more skilled at playing the game, but on who was willing to change the rules altogether. For both women, the final act was approaching. And the world was watching, waiting for one of them to emerge victorious and for the future of American politics to be rewritten. The final chapter of this political saga had arrived. And both Linda McMahon and Jasmine Crockett were about to face their greatest test yet. As the media coverage reached a fever pitch, the country stood divided, not only over who should lead, but what leadership in the future should truly look like. The clash of these two women, one a symbol of entrenched power and the other a beacon of hope for reform, had become something far greater than a personal rivalry. It was a symbolic battle for the soul of American democracy. Linda McMahon, once a titan in the world of political manipulation and media influence, was running out of time. The pressure on her had become unbearable. The scandal involving her past dealings with foreign leaders, the leaked emails, and the ever-growing media scrutiny had shaken her to the core. She had lost the trust of the public, the very foundation upon which her power had rested. Yet, despite the mounting odds, she refused to go quietly. McMahon had spent decades building her reputation, and she was determined not to let one scandal define her entire legacy. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, McMahon called a press conference. It was her moment to confront the accusations, head-on, to reclaim her place in the political arena, or at least fight for a redemption that seemed increasingly out of reach. The room was packed with journalists, cameras flashing, eager for her to speak. Her voice, though tired, was steady as she began her statement. "I am not a perfect person," McMahon said, her eyes steady, but the weariness in her expression evident. "I've made mistakes, like anyone else. But the attacks on my character have been malicious and unfounded. I've spent my life serving this country, and I won't allow anyone to rewrite my legacy. I am still fighting for the America I believe in, and I will continue to do so, regardless of the challenges ahead." Her words were met with mixed reactions. Some applauded her for taking responsibility, while others saw it as a hollow attempt to save face. But one thing was clear: McMahon had played her final card. Whether it was enough to win back the public's trust remained to be seen. She had spent years crafting a narrative that suited her now. The truth was threatening to unravel everything she had built, but in her mind, the battle was far from over. She wasn't going down without one last fight. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett found herself on the brink of her own defining moment. The smear campaign against her had reached its peak. The financial scandal, a fabricated story planted by her political enemies, had shaken her to the core. She knew it wasn't true, but the weight of the accusations had taken its toll. The media, hungry for controversy, had latched onto the narrative. And even her most loyal supporters were starting to question her in private. Crockett wrestled with the enormity of it all. The responsibility she carried was heavier than she could have ever imagined. She had been an idealist, someone who believed in change, in the power of truth, and in the possibility of a more just and equitable America. But now, faced with the possibility that the political system might crush her before she could make a real difference, Crockett felt the full weight of what she had chosen. In a quiet moment, Crockett reflected on her journey, how she had risen from nothing, how she had fought against a system that had always sought to silence her and others like her. She had become the voice for the voiceless, the champion of those who had long been ignored by Washington's power brokers. She knew she had to keep going, not just for her own future, but for the future of everyone who believed in the change. She stood for Dot. Then came the call. A summit had been arranged, a final high-stakes meeting between the two women. The meeting wasn't about policy or political strategy. It was about what they both represented: two opposing visions for the future of America. Linda McMahon, who had played by the rules of the establishment for decades, and Jasmine Crockett, who had come to symbolize the possibility of change from within a broken system. The meeting was set to take place in a neutral location, a high-rise in downtown Washington, away from the prying eyes of the press. When they met in the conference room, the tension was palpable. McMahon, her face set in a mask of controlled emotion, took her seat across from Crockett. The room was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the city below. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Finally, it was McMahon who broke the silence. "You've gained quite a following, Crockett. I'll give you that," McMahon said, her voice soft but cutting. "But what makes you think you're different from everyone else? You're just another politician, just another voice in a broken system." Crockett, who had expected the sharpness in McMahon's words, leaned forward. "I'm not like you, Linda," she said. "I'm not here to play the game. I'm here to change it. The system you've spent your life building is broken. And I'm not going to sit back and let it destroy everything I believe in." McMahon's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a recognition, a grudging respect. She had fought in the trenches for so long that part of her admired Crockett's idealism. Yet she couldn't let go of the power she had spent decades acquiring. She wasn't about to just hand it over. "You think you can fix this system?" McMahon scoffed, the corners of her mouth twisting into a bitter smile. "It's too big, too powerful. It'll crush you just like it's done to everyone else who's ever tried to change it." Crockett stood up, her back straight, her eyes unwavering. "I'm not afraid of the system," she said, her voice steady and clear. "And I'm not afraid of you, Linda. This fight isn't about power. It's about what's right. And I won't stop until we fix what's broken, no matter what it costs me." The room went silent again, but the tension between them had shifted. It was no longer just about politics. It was about something deeper. Linda McMahon, despite her years of experience, was faced with the truth that her time might be over. Crockett, in turn, realized that she was standing at the edge of everything she had dreamed, of a chance to change the very system that had sought to crush her. The summit ended without a clear resolution, but the battle between the two women had taken its final form. Both would continue to fight for their version of America, but it was clear that this moment had changed them both forever. In the end, the world was watching, waiting for the future to unfold. Would Linda McMahon regain her place at the top? Or would Jasmine Crockett truly be the change that America had been waiting for? The final act in this political thriller was not about who won or lost, it was about the future of a nation at a crossroads. And the outcome, still uncertain, would shape the world for years to come.